Well, hello plant lovers, welcome to my channel. Thank you for finding me surrounded by glorious orchids today. And if you're curious who, why and what, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without the help of grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers or any equipment. Really just me and them, either outside or inside, or I don't try at all. So if they sound like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday and I really am an amateur struggling my way with these orchids to try and find what works and what doesn't. Maybe my ramblings will help you. And today's rambling, strangely enough, is about these fabulous things in bloom in front of me, which are, of course, Coelogynes. Ah, glorious fragrance. And every time I mention Coelogynes, I have to mention Rachel in Gardening at Douentza in Ireland, because I first watched her orchid videos and her Coelogynes when they're in bloom and her Coelogyne videos. And I'd never heard of the orchid before. And it was her videos that prompted me to try and find them here in Australia. And here they are. So Rachel, it's all your fault. But it's not a culture of blame, and I'm very grateful because they are so easy for me to grow and they are delicious. So what we're going to do, because I have two in bloom now, I've got one in spike and one bloomed earlier, so we're going to do a little bit of a Coelogyne roundup. Now you do know I love a little bit of nomenclature, so Coelogyne comes from the Greek, two different Greek words, one koleos meaning hollow and one gyne meaning pistil or woman, and it refers to the cavity for the implanting of the pollen. Slightly esoteric, sometimes I do prefer a more romantic name, but never mind. Now we've got lots of books to reference, I'll come to them individually, but Coelogynes, so that's what it means. Let me grab this other book, which is new to me. It's not a new book, let me tell you when it was published. 1991, there we are. Let me not get the light on it. A Guide to Orchids of the World by Margaret Hodgson, Roland Payne and Neville Anderson. There we go. And it was published by Angus and Robertson, which is actually an Australian publisher. I found this in a second-hand shop. So the thing about Coelogynes, firstly, is that there's quite a wide distribution. So let's just have a look at this book, because it actually has a map of distribution, which is wonderful. So you can see there. So the Coelogyne species start in the Himalayas, India, and really spread all the way across Southeast Asia and across into the Pacific. None in Australia, but quite an interesting map for you to understand. Now that is a wide geographic range. So it is important to remember that there are Coelogynes and there are Coelogynes and there are Coelogynes. Just like Cymbidiums, there are cooler, higher growing Cymbidiums and there are lower growing, more tropical Cymbidiums. Same with Coelogynes. So many books, many orchid growing books do tend to lump them all together, but it's really important to understand what type of Coelogyne you've got or that you want and what your growing conditions are. And this is part of the bigger story about trying to figure out what grows for you in your climate. And because I don't have a greenhouse or any heating, my orchids have to survive outside or inside, two very distinct microclimates. But of course, within those two areas, there are also sub-microclimates. And these orchids I wanted to grow outside all year. So the Coelogynes for me that do really well are the higher altitude ones. And higher altitude plants can be from many different countries. You can get cool growing high altitude orchids from the Philippines, for example, an area you tend to assume with warm, tropical, humid conditions. So it's not necessarily sort of the country or geography, but it's really the altitude that these plants grow at, which will give you an idea as to what they're going to thrive in. And this book, Orchids of the World, is the only book that actually spells that out. So I'm just going to read this to you because I think it's quite interesting. Because of the great variance of temperature requirements of the various species, the genus can be divided in three groups of species. A, those that require warm conditions at all times. B, those needing a more intermediate temperature and requiring a short rest period. And C, those from higher altitudes which thrive in cooler climates and require cool greenhouse conditions. Difficulties do arise with this group. And that's the group I've got. The other thing then, so this is called Growing Orchids. It's book 3 by J.N. Rentoul. There you go. And I've got all 4 volumes. I think there's 4 volumes. Very interesting. The thing is, of course, understanding of orchids changes rapidly and all the names change very rapidly, as we know. But The general care sort of instructions are quite interesting. Now, J.N. Rentoul says about Coelogyne cristata, which we'll get to, a large number of orchid growers will admit that among their frustrating experiences has been cultivating Coelogyne cristata and of looking at well-grown plants and wondering where they have been wrong as the flowers so consistently fail to appear. And the other thing this book talks about is, equally important, is non-disturbance once a plant is acclimatized. And really everyone talks about not repotting Coelogynes unless you absolutely have to. Okay, so that's our broad stroke of some of the specialist books talking about Coelogynes. So I guess the first thing to realize is they come from a broad expanse. Some are low growing, more tropical plants. Others are much more higher altitude, cooler, misty mountain orchids. Now, those higher altitude orchids tend to do really well for me here in Melbourne, as long as you are conscious of our hot summers and just protect them a little bit. But all my Coelogynes have done really well. However, I have tried to grow some of those more, the A, B and C types, so some that are more intermediate and some that are definitely tropical, and I've come a cropper because they really, surprisingly enough, don't like the cold. So first thing, understand your climate, whether you have got a heated greenhouse or you're in a cool climate. And secondly, then choose the Coelogyne that's appropriate. And then the hybrids thereof, of which there'll be many. There are many. Thing is though, the flowers aren't all that different, so you might not need thousands of Coelogynes in your life, but a couple are very beautiful. And one that really is a cultivar of mine, which is called Jannine Banks. Now that flowered in autumn for me, which was April earlier of this year. I'm in the Southern Hemisphere. And let's step back in time and look at the video I made when that one was in bloom in preparation for this Coelogyne epic. Hello plant lovers, it is autumn and this Coelogyne that I have in bloom now is Coelogyne Jannine Banks. And there's the label, which is misspelt because Janine actually has double N. Jannine. Anyway, we'll forgive whoever wrote it. And this is a cross between Coelogyne flaccida and Muriana. Now I have flaccida, so hopefully in this Coelogyne epic we can look at that. I don't though, plant lovers, have Muriana, and I have actually just spotted one for sale. Shall I go there? Now, flaccida has pendulous stems covered in blooms. It's very foliferous, and I think it's got that sort of depth of colour from flaccida and the size of the flower from Muriana. If I get Muriana and it flowers, we'll have to see. The other thing though is the fragrance, and as it's blooming now, it literally does smell like jonquils or daffodils. Beautiful. It's a very, very lovely plant. Now it's autumn now for me, but this has also bloomed in winter, so it can bloom twice a year. It really depends what's going on with the growth. Now let's have a look at the bulbs. They are really massive. I think these are the biggest of any of my Coelogynes actually. Really, really large bulbs. So it's not a prolific grower. So some of the, like flaccida for example, will produce multiple growth points, but not Janine. She tends to do it just once, but I've now got 2 growth points. So the plant has got a sort of a longish rhizome and it's growing at either end. And you can see here that I have got a second flower spike. So the great thing is that when this flower spike goes over, this one will be open. In fact, they might even be open at the same time. The flowers do last quite a long time, so that will be a joy to behold. But like most Coelogynes, they bloom from the base of the new bulb of last year's new growth. So the name of the game is to grow new bulbs. And I'm just seeing that here we have a beautiful new bulb emerging actually from the middle of the plant. So maybe I'm going to get 3 growth points in future. And so there are Coelogynes, as we've said, from various parts of the world in terms of the temperatures that they require. But these Himalayan ones do love Melbourne. I've made some mistakes with others that are tropical and they just don't have that cool tolerance. They really need to be in a warm environment. So pick your Coelogyne well, but Jannine Banks is a showstopper and really, really easy. As with all of them, I do a topical application of fertilizer in spring and I try and give a liquid fertilizer or tonic throughout the growing season, the warmer season of the year. But I do still water quite frequently in winter. They do dry out a bit more, but I still water them, particularly cristata, because I've just found they do better and they basically won't flower. Cristata won't flower if you don't water it throughout the winter season. So bear that in mind. Many people, or you will read, that they should have a completely dry rest and let the bulbs really shrivel. Well, mine don't. So as you can see, there isn't a huge amount of difference from one flower to the next, I must say, but this one is particularly large, the colors are particularly strong, the fragrance is beautiful. I think, you know, once you've got a couple of Coelogynes, you've probably got them all. It's a bit like visiting Gothic cathedrals. Seen one, seen them all. But there is enough variation to make it worth getting a couple. And there's some beautiful hybrids which are sort of green and black, which look very interesting. And they're drawn from slightly more warmer climate Coelogynes. So have to see if I can tread that path. But for the moment, the cooler climate ones are my bag. I am going to try and do the tropical ones again and grow them indoors, but I killed the last two and can't find them again. So there you go. There's that lesson learnt. But Janine Banks is a winner. It's potted as, well, not all of them, but this one is in a pre-drilled orchid pot, which is fantastic. I have a feeling that the supplier of this might have more. I'll investigate. And then practically it is in a medium to small bark mix, actually, because the roots on this, they're actually quite chunky, but for some reason it's relatively small bark. But anyway, they're epiphytes, so they're just like a free draining mix. I wouldn't get that hung up, but I don't think I've mixed anything else with this. So no perlite or sphagnum, just that mix. I think in others I may have put in a bit of perlite and sphagnum, just depends how I was feeling. But this one, just to get the medium around the roots and to fill the pot, I have used a smaller bark. Anyway, a Vander basket will do, or a hanging basket just lined with much looser coconut fiber, or a jewel your own pot. I have my own jewel your own pot video, easy to do. Either way, plenty of air movement throughout the roots. And the other thing is, they do say that Coelogynes don't like to be disturbed that much. So kind of pot it where it's going to be for quite some time. And if it's in a small basket, I would just allow it to tumble around and claim its home rather than worry too much about repotting and splitting it. Obviously there will come a point where you have to, and mine is sort of reaching the edge of this pot, so I'm going to see what it does. If it just is happy to grow over the edge and cling, I'm going to let it do that. So we'll have to see. Anyway, plant lovers, in our Coelogyne epic, here we have Coelogyne Janine Banks, which is so easy to grow, so reliable, a wonderful part of the cooler temperature Coelogyne family, so you should definitely have a go. And if you can grow Cymbidiums, as I've said, you can grow this type of cool climate Coelogynes. Off you go. Hang your Coelogynes above your Cymbidiums. They will love the same conditions. Well, there you are, plant lovers. Isn't it a beautiful plant? Really massive flowers and a delicious, delicious plant. Slightly different growing habit, I think, to the others. Now, the two I've got here are two forms of a cultivar called Coelogyne Unchained Melody. Very, very common, very easy to find. And that is a hybrid between Coelogyne cristata and Coelogyne flaccida. And we'll get to those two species in a minute. You can see that the flower spike comes from the base of the new pseudobulb, which you can see there. And you can see quite clearly there, actually. So it just emerges as a little green nib out from that point there. Also the same point where a new growth appears, so you just have to understand what the timing is for your plant to flower and when the timing is for it to have a new growth, and not get confused and disappointed. So here we have then, as I said, two versions of Unchained Melody. So this one is the classic example, which has got beautiful white flowers and that sort of egg yolky golden interior to the lip and splashes of sort of saffron orange, I think. And then this one is basically the same, but called Alba, which means it is white. And as you can see, the flowers are actually a little bit smaller, but almost pure white with just a little bit of pale yellow to the lip. They're both in bloom at the same time, and they both are the beautiful meeting of two species, Coelogyne cristata and Coelogyne flaccida. Now I have cristata, and that's actually in spike now, and that's a sort of a later spring bloomer for me. And I have made a video about that, which I'll link up here. And one of the things I think that all of these books does talk about too is the notion of rest periods and slight dry periods, depending on where the orchid came from. Now, Rachel at Gardening Duensa and I are firmly of the opinion that Coelogyne cristata needs to be watered all the way through winter, so no rest period for that. And if you don't water it well throughout winter, you're not going to get flowers. Now, that is not something you actually read much. It's only through experience, actually. And Rachel had the same experience, and I certainly did too. Now, what it might well love is in spring, a little bit of a drying period, but in winter, you certainly do water it, which is perhaps a little different to lots of orchids where you do really wind down the watering in winter, particularly if they're outside in my climate, but not cristata. And when it is in bloom, it is the most extraordinary sight. Now, I did read that Unchained Melody, as it's called, is actually something to be a naturally occurring hybrid between Coelogyne cristata and Coelogyne flaccida. So it is found in the wild, but it was also hybridized in horticulture. So just in terms of understanding care then, cristata, one of the origins of this, is very much a high altitude Himalayan plant. So from the sort of eastern Himalayas, so Nepal, Assam, tops of India, Tibet, around that sort of part of the world, but relatively contained. But then Coelogyne flaccida starts at that same point, but then moves all the way across southern China, all the way down through Southeast Asia. So a much bigger distribution and a greater variety of altitudes. So flaccida can grow at a lower altitude, which means it would like warmer temperatures than cristata, its cousin. Which then means when you get the meeting of beautiful minds to create this hybrid, Unchained Melody, it could kind of go either way, I suppose. So you've got to figure out what works for you. But it certainly thrives in my climate. So mine are outside, undercover all year. So they don't get rained on. But as I said, I do water all through winter. They get plenty of air movement and I hang them quite high. And in fact, in the case of the regular Unchained Melody, I probably had it a little too high and it probably got a little too much bright light because some of the leaves are just a little bit burnt. But bright, indirect light, and then my temperatures can drop to, sometimes the coldest nights in winter can get to 3 degrees centigrade, so just above freezing. That's like the high 30s Fahrenheit. But we don't freeze and we don't get frosts here in the inner city of Melbourne. You certainly can the further out you get, but not where I am. And these orchids thrive. So somehow Melbourne sort of replicates those high Himalayan conditions. And lots of orchids from that same part of the world, so a lot of species, Cymbidiums and Holcoglossums and some Dendrobiums, love that condition and do really well for me. Basically with no care and attention, they just do their thing. So it is spring now and we've got these amazing, amazing blooms. So Unchained Melody, the classic one here. What have we got? 1, 2, so we've got 5 spikes from this. Look at that, isn't it just stunning? My goodness, it is such a beautiful flower and a fragrance that's quite sort of daffodil jonquilly. I mean, they don't look dissimilar color palette wise, and of course it's spring, so there's lots of daffodils and jonquils out right now. Beautiful, a lovely fragrance. And I've got both of these in the room here and they are not overpowering the room, but it's a beautiful room fragrance. So in those books, it does mention that fact about these plants not loving to be disturbed. So as you can see, this is just resting in this lovely Japanese mid-century pot for ease. But what you can see here is that it very much has a zest for life in one direction. And in fact, I've kind of got 2 growth directions here, as you can see. So this is producing new growths and this producing new growths. And then each of those sort of areas is producing the flower spikes. So they're largely epiphytes, obviously. I think about 75% of the orchids of the world are. Sometimes lithophytes, depending on the species, but still an altitude plant and still growing on moss and detritus. So a lithophyte that grows, you know, in those nooks, like many lithophytic orchids do. And it's very much a sort of a creeper. So as you can see, that habit. Which means it can be tricky. As you can see with this pot, it is really making a break for it in one direction, yet to release its hit single, but anyway, and it is sort of climbing over the pot. So they do very well in baskets, and I have now started to pot the newer Coelogynes I've got in hanging baskets, and I'm just going to leave them. And I think it is quite fair to say they don't love a disturbance, but I don't think you're going to, you know, really put the plant against you by repotting it, because of course sometimes you have to, particularly if you buy one and it's sent bare rooted, you've got to pot it up. And my experience has been, I think, like Cymbidiums, you might get a year of sulking, before the plant then settles down and starts to flower for you. So I did buy some plants last autumn and repotted them immediately, and they haven't bloomed for me at the moment. So I think next year, next flowering season in spring, we should get those two to flower. We'll have another Coelogyne roundup when they do, because they are slightly different and quite beautiful. So I guess when you're deciding to pot, just commit to it and give it a little bit of room, which is perhaps not what you would normally do potting your orchids, but give it a basket where it can just tumble over. You can also use the wooden slatted baskets that are designed for vandas, really fantastic for Coelogynes. So just line that with either loose coconut or sphagnum moss, and then your bark, and then off you go. So as it is epiphytic, or some of them lithophytic, no great surprise with your medium. Really depends where you are in the world in terms of your relative temperatures and humidities, etc. But I just use a medium bark with a little bit of perlite and a little bit of sphagnum moss, just to enable the moisture to be retentive but also free draining, because these high altitude ones do not generally like to dry out completely. Some of them might like a little bit of a drier period in late spring after they've flowered, but really not an orchid you want to let dry out. So that is your classic Unchained Melody, a stunning, very floriferous and easy to grow plant. And then this is the Alba form, which is a bit more delicate, slightly smaller flowers. Look at that, isn't it gorgeous? Again, I've got 5 spikes here, and I've got this wonderful pre-holed pot, which came from a supplier that never had them again, although the word on the street is that they might have them again. They're made in Vietnam, and Vietnam was very badly affected by COVID, and a lot of these businesses either ceased production or went out of business. But I think this one has revved up again, so I might have to go and investigate that, plant lovers. But the Alba form, as the name might suggest, is basically just plain white with that little bit of yellow lip, and essentially pretty similar growing habits. And this plant, it's quite hard to show you, but essentially it's doing the same thing as its regular cousin. So it's got 2 directions of growth. So we've got one sort of rhizome growing that way and one growing this way. And you can see perhaps there you have quite a strong stem with the rhizome as each new bulb is produced, and then the flower spike. And so after the flower has died, you'll get your new growth point emerging just here, and then the plant will continue. And the name of the game, of course, is to get multiple growth points, because it's the new pseudobulb that matures the following season produces your flower spike. So that is very much like a Cymbidium or an Oncidium. Many, many orchids, in fact, will flower from the newly matured pseudobulb. So give it the right conditions, give it the right light, give it the right moisture, and give it some food, and you'll get flowers. So all of these are the cooler climate ones, so they do need cooler temperatures to thrive. So if you were, say, in southern Britain, an unheated greenhouse might be fine, depends how cold it got, but they also are able to deal with my summer temperatures. So as long as there's a bit of a difference between the season, these plants are loving life. We alluded to food. I use a general slow release fertilizer in spring with most of my orchids and just sprinkle it on the top of the medium. And then throughout the growing period, which tends to be the warmer parts of the year, I do use a variety of liquid fertilizers. So that can be orchid specific or general flowering plant liquid fertilizer, or something that's more like a tonic, which can be your home brew from your worm farm, or a seaweed based solution. All of those, though, I really dilute down to sort of 1/8, 1/10 of the recommended dose, so that you're not giving them too much. But I think the thing is just to make sure you are really clear which Coelogyne you've got and what it wants from a moisture perspective. So if you're unclear, if you've got a hybrid with a name, such as my Janine banks, which we saw, then you can go to orchidroots.com, and I'll put that below. Now that's a great place to find out what are the species ancestors of your hybrid orchids. So you type in the name Coelogyne Janine banks, and it will tell you what the who do you think you are chain of ancestry of that plant is, and it will bring you down to the 2 species types that were the originators of the plant. Then you can search both of those 2 on orchidspecies.com, which I'll put below. And from there, you'll be able to see what the climate was for the species and its preferred conditions. And then you can make an educated guess, because your hybrid's going to have different qualities from the 2 different species it was derived from. But generally, I think if you've got cool growing, high altitude Coelogynes, they're probably all going to take similar conditions. It's when you get to the lower growing tropical ones, you need to read from a different book. Now, as Jane Austen may have said, it is a truth universally acknowledged that if you can grow cool climate Cymbidiums, you can grow cool climate Coelogynes. So they do come from very similar areas in the Himalayan parts of Asia, and they flower at about the same time. So all my Coelogynes are open right now, and they can take basically the same conditions. So your Cymbidiums will be lower down because they're sort of more an understory plant. The Coelogynes are much more epiphytic and sort of higher. So if you can, you could hang your Coelogynes in the same area where your Cymbidiums are lower down. So dappled, bright, indirect light, water throughout the winter, cooler winter temperatures, can deal with summer heat, just keep them moist and don't let them dry out. So there we are, plant lovers. We have swept through Coelogynes, well, the cooler growing Coelogynes 101. So I think that's the important thing to remember. There are beautiful tropical ones. Now, I did have a beautiful Coelogyne usitana, which is a lower altitude growing tropical, subtropical orchid from the Philippines, and it's sequentially blooming and has this fantastic zigzagging raceme with the flowers appearing down. And I thought, oh, I'm going to try that in my climate. Of course, it hated winter and died immediately. And I thought, well, I can just get another one. Oh no, plant lovers, never been able to find one again. That was in the early days of my orchid growing. What I will not do is experiment with a hard to find tropical orchid again. If it's easy to find, I'll see if I can push the limits with my growing conditions, but not something unusual. But I didn't know that at the time. And actually, when I was at the OzCov Orchid Spectacular, there was an amazing specimen there, which just made my heart bleed a little bit because that could have been me, but never mind. I will still try and find one. It might have to be a flask at this point because it's really hard to find the plant itself, but you never know. Someone might have a division because it is certainly growing here in Australia, and that would be something that I would grow inside all year, all the time, if the gods smile and bring it my way again. So there we are. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed our Coelogyne deep dive. It is beautiful. They are such great orchids. So I think lots of vague information. Maybe join your local orchid club, find out what people are growing near you and how they're growing it, whether they grow them inside or with heat or in greenhouses, or whether they grow them outside if you're in a climate like mine, which doesn't get super cold. Figure out what people are growing and then off you go. But if you have success with Cymbidiums, the hybrid, regular sort of cool climate Cymbidiums, you'll have success with Coelogynes. So you wouldn't even need to do any research. Just get out there and get yourself some Coelogynes. And I will be getting out there and doing something next week. I'm not sure what it will be, but if you want to know what, hit subscribe. I do post every Friday. My ramblings are rambly and amateurish, so do forgive any inconsistencies. But I hope all is well where you are, and I look forward very much to seeing you next week.